Thank you very much for that introduction. How is the voice? Is that too loud? It's okay? Because it's quite noisy, this particular. Okay. So I want to thank you very much for the invitation to come here. It's really fun to take part in this summer academy, and I'm very impressed with the number of PhD students that you have. And I've talked to a few, and they're really very keen, so congratulations for that. I'm going to talk about the 40th anniversary, 40 years of the World Heritage Convention. And to put that in context, let's see if that works. Yes, just so you don't get lost, I'm going to do it in 4 blocks. I'm going to talk about the origins of the convention, and then I'm going to talk quite briefly about how it's been implemented. And then I've decided that it would be, after talking with Professor Albert, I decided to do something I haven't done before, which is to work out 9 questions, research issues and questions that sit there, to my mind, that need to have further research. And then a little bit on going forward, although the going forward is a little bit murky. Now, just to orient you a bit, Mechtilde Rossler and I are working on a book on the origins of the World Heritage Convention up to the year 2000. And so what I'm going to tell you is really some of the stuff that has come up in the process of doing this research. And the idea was born on the 60th anniversary of the founding of UNESCO. And there was a big conference in 2005 in UNESCO, and you can see some of the products of that. And it was basically an invitation to people from around the world, academics, to engage in researching the various parts of the institution. What had UNESCO achieved in that time? And one element of it was to do oral archives, to capture the voices of people who were going to disappear from the scene, to have some witness of what they had done. So on that basis, we started in 2006, and I just show you some of the faces of the people we interviewed, which gives you, I think it's quite, I'm going to turn this so I can see without, okay, that's better for me. Just on the right, if you look, we've got the 3 directors general that were there from the beginning. M. Bao on the top, who was director general from 79 to 87, and then we've got Mr. Mayor from 87 to 99, and then Mr. Matsuura, who is left, I guess, in 8, 9, no, 10, 11, 2 years ago, yeah. And then the other person of this group that I just would draw your attention to, because it actually ties into what Professor Albert was saying about those early nominations that were very monumental, is the person who briefed for the cultural properties for 10 years was one person who was Professor Pressweir, and he's in the middle on the second row. He's in the middle of the second column, under just above Dawson Munjeri from Zimbabwe. And we were very fortunate to interview him because about 5 months later he died. And we have a 2-hour interview with him, which is really a good interview. And we learned some things that we had no idea about, including how he had to go back and write the documents for the first 3 years of inscriptions, which had never been written. And he hadn't even gone to the meetings. So he told us this. I was astounded. I hadn't heard that before. So this is kind of the project. There are just a second slide. To show you, we've been interviewing people. We've been very opportunistic. When we were in Brazil, and we did 5 people when we were in Brazil and at the World Heritage Committee meeting, and trying to organize studios and so on. It's been quite a project from that point of view. But the book is almost done, and it has 6 basic blocks. I don't know in the end if the publisher will keep it in 6 chapters, because some are quite a bit longer than others. But one is on the creation of the convention, and I'm going to speak to that today. The process, how they set up the process for actually listing sites and then populating the list up to the year 2000. Then a chapter on conservation, and then a chapter on the players, and that's all the different bodies that participate, like the countries and the advisory bodies and secretariat and so on. And then finally an assessment. And the assessment is mostly in the voices of the pioneers that we interviewed, and it's very interesting to hear how they think it succeeded and didn't succeed, and what the problems are. So I'm going to start with the origins, but I think I really have to say to this crowd of young people that you have to put yourself back into the 1960s and think of what kinds of communications were available at that time. There were no cell phones. There was no fax, I think. There were no computers. The only way you communicated was with letters, face-to-face, or telephone. That was it. And so overseas cables, which probably is a word you have never heard, which are kind of telegrams. But the reason I'm telling you this is that there is as I tell this story, there are two senior people in UNESCO who are involved in two different proposals and over 5 years, and they've never talked to each other. So it's just amazing, but you have to also understand communications were different. It's not like the text, and all that. Okay. So I'm dividing this into natural heritage and cultural heritage to begin with. I think you all know the World Heritage Convention is both. But we have to go back and see what the roots are on each side, because the roots are very similar in a way, and they're born of a period of great optimism and a great opening up to the world. And it was a very beautiful time, in a sense. I guess the German word is Zeitgeist. And there was really a spirit of wanting to open up after the war and all the terrible things that had happened, and to reach out and with other people in other countries. On the natural side, the Director General of UNESCO was quite instrumental in creating an international organization on the natural heritage side called at the beginning, the International Union for Nature Protection, which eventually became IUCN, and that was very early after the war. So that group was an international group, mostly European and North American, who got together from time to time and talked about the need to protect the special places of the world. And they eventually managed to get through the UN process, not through the UNESCO process. The UN list of protected areas and equivalent reserves in 1962, which was an awareness to alert countries to the fact that, according to their scientific view, these were places around the world that needed to be protected. And at the same time, there was the First World Congress of National Parks, which was held in Seattle, Washington. And what's important about that is that for the most part, they were still looking at individual species and individual plants and so on. But there was this parks planning part, which was new, and that was a more comprehensive look at natural heritage in a kind of ecosystem sense, which is you start to see the influence of the environmental movement. The reason I have Hal Coolidge's picture there is he was one of the key players. America was very strong in this movement. He's the son of a president, and he had a lot of power, and he was very big. In fact, I think he became eventually the Secretary General in IUCN in the 60s. So he was a very important person. And in the same period, before 1965, we have UNESCO, which is newly formed. UNESCO was created in 1945, and on the cultural side, they felt the need to bring together international experts on heritage to be kind of a sounding board and to give them advice on various things. And the first thing that came out of that world was, because it's post-war, was the Hague Convention for the Protection of Property, cultural property in times of conflict, which is a convention that you know, but which is kind of a more defensive kind of thing. But at the same time, they created this new institution. It was actually seen in a way as a branch of UNESCO, which was the ICROM, the International, I always get the name wrong, International Center for the Study of Preservation and Restoration of Cultural Property in Rome. And they were to be technical. They were to do research on materials and all that, and to teach people how to intervene on paintings and how to intervene on monuments. So it was a very technical, hands-on kind of training. At the same time, they started to do international campaigns to save very selected monuments, which is one of the ideas in behind the World Heritage Convention. And the first one was when the Aswan Dam was going to be created in 1959 in Egypt, and it was going to flood a lot of Egyptian monuments. UNESCO was able to, I think, engage 80 countries or something in making contributions, which was really an extraordinary gesture of international cooperation. So they did that one, and I'm showing you a couple of others. They had a number of these campaigns for selected properties that had real problems and needed help. So the campaigns were going on. There was on the side, interestingly, very early on, a recommendation about saving the beauty and character of landscapes and sites, which again is marrying nature and culture a bit. And I want to keep coming back to this theme because these are ideas that are circulating at this time. And there were architects, and I've shown these two who were both leaders in heritage conservation or conservation of monuments, and this is coming back to the origins. Piero Gazzola from Rome, and then Raymond Lemaire from Belgium. And these two architects were instrumental in bringing together conservation or restoration architects, and they, at a meeting in 1964, they laid down this, what we know as the Venice Charter, which I think probably most of you have studied that or looked at it, which was to giving a doctrinal view on how to, for the conservation and restoration of monuments and sites, which, by the way, it's almost 50 years, and it would be quite good to do some research on whether or not the Venice Charter still stands. This is a whole research area that I think could be interesting. And in that same meeting, they did create an international group, a bit like IUCN, but much later, called the International Council of Monuments and Sites. So you had IUCN over there in the nature, and you had ICOMOS on the cultural side. Now, the catalyst, I said that the Americans were very active. The Americans in the 1960s were very outward-looking. It's a very different society today, but they wanted to reach out, and they were very interested in engaging the world in a positive way. I mean, it's when they had all of the youth programs going to different parts of the world and all that. And they created, on the 20th anniversary of the United Nations, which of course is housed in the U.S., they created this big White House conference on international cooperation, and they had over 30 different committees working. It was a huge conference and in agriculture and forestry and all sorts of subjects, all the subjects you could imagine where there could be international cooperation. One of those committees was on natural resource conservation and development, and it's here that the idea of a World Heritage Trust was born. And the people who were involved, I'll come back to the words, but the people who were really key in that, one was Joe Fisher. Yes, mine is quite distorted, but this is better. Okay, Joe Fisher was the chairman of that committee, and as far as I can figure out, he's the guy who wrote down on the back of the cigarette package, as it would have been at the time, or on the, on the tablecloth. He wrote down the idea, and Russell Train was the person who actually worked and crafted the words. And you can see that I was able to interview Russell Train in 2008. He was 88 then. He's still alive. His memory was pretty good, actually. As you can see, we were in a rock band studio, and he had to sit, this gentleman who arrived, as you see, in a three-piece suit. I had to make him sit on a bar stool with all this shag rug all around and so on. Anyway, he was pretty good. All that to say, and the words are really important, and I'm going to pause a bit on the words. Okay, so in the text it said that there be established a trust for World Heritage that would be responsible to the world community. There's one of the ideas that sits in World Heritage, responsible to the world, for the stimulation of international cooperative efforts. Again, this is another of the key ideas, is international cooperation, to identify, establish, develop, and manage the world's superb natural and scenic and historic sites. So the whole range of culture and nature is there for present and future generations on behalf of the world's citizenry. So you can see that the ideas of World Heritage are all sitting in that particular meeting, and that's why many people say that's where World Heritage was born, but I argue that it grew out of what I've shown you before. Now, after 1965 on the natural side, by the way, although the White House Conference has nature and culture, UNESCO was totally dissociated from that activity. This was really the IUCN group, because they were connected with the Americans. So IUCN General Assembly in 1966, Fisher goes over, makes a big pitch for the World Heritage Trust, and they get on a roll, IUCN, to create a draft convention. It's really environmentally focused. It's based on that 1962 list, but that list had cultural and some natural and some cultural sites, and so it did here. At the same time, in UNESCO, still sort of going along with these campaigns, the General Conference asked the Director General of UNESCO to explore a system of international protection for a few of the monuments. Again, this was really thinking along in terms of campaigns. It was a very select list that are part of the cultural heritage of mankind. This is UNESCO, UNESCOese. At the same time, they're working on, the 60s is a period of great development, so there is this recommendation about trying to protect cultural property in the face of essentially auto routes being driven through and a lot of neighborhoods being torn down because there's a lot of development. But on this other track, we have expert meetings in 68 that talk about making two instruments, and one is for an international list with only a few sites, and then a national list or a national recommendation for countries to look after the rest of their heritage. And that was what was in their minds. So they have a draft convention in 1970, and it's got both culture and nature, but their nature is landscape. And these are both involved with very senior people in UNESCO, in different buildings, but both in UNESCO. So they didn't know each other was working on that. That's why I said you have to understand the communications of the time. It's a different era. So what was the catalyst that brought them together? It was the first World Summit on the Human Environment. This is the era of the environmental awareness of environmental movement. And there were these preparatory meetings leading up to this summit, and IUCN arrived with its draft convention and said, we want this international summit to endorse this and countries to buy onto it. And then UNESCO said, but wait a minute, we have a cultural one. You can't do this. So the two were the organizers of the Stockholm preparatory meetings had these two, and then the Americans wrote a third one. So there were three draft conventions floating around in 71. And the decision was made. UNESCO pushed very hard to arguing that the S and the C were for culture and science, that it was really UNESCO's role to take this, because the Secretariat was supposed to be at IUCN. And UNESCO came and grabbed that at this moment. And so at the Stockholm meeting, they just endorsed this process, and then the convention was actually negotiated at the end of 72, and that became it. And just to say that the Secretary General who actually called the shots is a Canadian called Maurice Strong, who's still around. And the two people in UNESCO were Mr. Bola, whom we did interview, and Mr. Baptiste, who's dead now. And the two of them have written this little booklet, which you've probably read, which gives in some detail their maneuvers over going to New York, which was a big experience to go to New York at that point and to try and intervene on this file. Okay, so that's how the convention was created. And keep in mind the select number of monuments, keep in mind the international cooperation and so on, because some of these things come to play again. So then we get to the implementation. The key ideas are very simple. I mean, the convention is not that long, but the key ideas are really about identifying the most important properties. The second is about conserving them, and the third is about mobilizing international aid to help the ones that are in trouble. And the concept, which we were already talking about, is that it's heritage that is so valuable that doesn't belong to a country, it belongs to everybody. That's the concept. And it's places of nature and or cultural heritage or value. And we have this threshold of outstanding universal value. Outstanding universal value is mentioned 14 times in the English version of the convention, and it's never defined. So this is a problem. And this is one of the issues that you're going to see comes back, because essentially how the committee will determine it is that they have to create criteria. And we'll come back to that. Anyway, today, as Mechtild was saying, there are now 190 countries, and unlike the small select list that was envisaged, there are now 962 World Heritage Sites. I'll come back to that. Okay, so just to say very briefly so you have some sense of how it works, there is the big circle is all of the states' parties. There are 190 now. But the committee is only 21, and they're elected on rotation. Very, very competitive process, kind of an ugly process. The committee is all-powerful, and for instance, at St. Petersburg, there were at least 1,000 people there, and the only people who spoke over 12 days are those 21 members. So there's something very wrong with the dialogue now. I chaired the meeting twice. I chaired in 1990 and I chaired in 2008. In 1990, there were probably 200 people in the room. There actually was time for everybody to say something. It's impossible now. I mean, it's just it's a vast room full of people, and they really have to control the time all the time. And so it's not the best dialogue from that point of view. We have the UNESCO Secretariat, which is currently under a lot of pressure, as you're probably aware that the Americans have withdrawn their funding, and then UNESCO has lost 22% of its funds, which means that there's a lot of cutting going on, so this is not good. And then you have the 3 advisory bodies, and you will notice that those 3 bodies were all groups that were created in some respect by UNESCO, and that's why they were associated with it. My understanding is that ICROM, the one in Rome, actually kind of pushed its way onto the agenda, that it was not supposed to be the 3rd advisory body. There was going to be one culture, one nature, and that because ICROM is an intergovernmental body, it was felt that they couldn't evaluate in a neutral way. They couldn't evaluate nominations. So ICOMOS has always done the nominations, but ICROM argued that it would be very important to have its skill set available for post-inscription, which is fair. I put this little picture of the stool there. This is one of my little pet peeves. What happens when one of the legs goes? This convention can only work if each part, the 3 legs of that stool, are fully carrying their weight and are interconnected. And at the moment, the leg related to advisory bodies, related to expertise, is crumbling because it's under big attack. And so this is a very serious threat to the convention, in my view. So I said that the committee had to create criteria to decide what is outstanding universal value. I'm not really going to run over them. There are 10 criteria. And there are also conditions about authenticity. I'm going to talk later about authenticity and integrity, which are all the parts there that need to be there to demonstrate fully outstanding universal value. And effective management, which means is there a management plan? Is there legal protection? Is there some capacity in the country to look after the place, and so on? So those are all the elements that the committee takes into account when it decides to put a site on the list. I don't think I'm going to take time on the criteria, just to say that there are 10. There are 4 for nature and 6 for culture. The committee also has a rather limited toolkit in terms of protection and conservation. It has reactive monitoring, which means people write in and say they're doing terrible things here, and this is where civil society actually has a role to play. There is periodic reporting, which is the countries on a cyclical basis reporting themselves on the state of their sites, which can be uneven. The committee can put sites on the endanger list, although countries resist that. They don't want to be on the endanger list. And the committee can delete sites. That's about the extent of their toolkit, plus financial support. There is a World Heritage Fund, which is very, very, very slender. If you think, I mean, in my own country, to fix one, we have a canal, Heritage Canal, on the World Heritage List. It has 45 lock stations. To fix one lock station properly is $1 million. The World Heritage Fund is about $3.5 million for 962 sites. So, like, it is not a player. However, there are voluntary contributions, and there are actually big foundations like the World Bank and so on that occasionally will fund a project. And there is some money flowing in from selling the brand, essentially, for filming or for partnerships with Expedia or whatever. But there's not that much financial support, honestly. So now we get to the questions. So that's very fast how it's being implemented. Those are the main tools that are available. Okay. Here are my questions. The first question is the World Heritage List limitless? Is there a limit? Something we asked the pioneers, and they all philosophically rejected that notion. Some, from a philosophical point of view, there is the consideration of how much capacity the world has and UNESCO has to actually keep track of sites. There is this is how it looks. A secondary issue for me, and has been for the committee from the beginning, is the balance right between cultural, which is the yellow, and natural sites, which is the green. The third is a mixed site, but the two big ones, there has always been a sense that many more cultural sites are being brought forward, and not enough natural sites. And there are reasons for that, in part because of sustainable development, I guess you would say, and people wanting to exploit natural sites and not wanting to tie them up. So that's my first question. Is it limitless? And the second question is the regional distribution of sites equitable? This is an old issue. And I have to say, hearing today that Germany put 10 sites on the list in 8 years is part of the issue. I will show you what the World Heritage list looks like today. The black is Africa. The yellow is Arab countries. The pinky color, I always think of Thailand, that's the Asia Pacific. And the blue is Europe and North America. And the turquoise is Latin America and the Caribbean. And what you can see there is that Europe has pretty close to 50% of the sites on the World Heritage List. And this is seen by the rest of the world as being very unfair. And it ebbs and flows, and it builds up, but there are some committees when it becomes very intense about the unfairness, and why aren't the countries in Europe and North America, instead of bringing more sites, why aren't they helping countries in the other parts of the world who need help? I mean, that's really the basic message. So the committee is not unaware of that, and started working in the 80s trying to figure out ways of encouraging nominations from different parts of the world, but still within very much an art historical frame, which is what Marie-Therese was talking about. By 1994, it was almost a crisis, this issue, and there was a small group who sat. I chaired it, Mechtilde was in the room, but it was a very small group of people who worked on a new framework, which was then approved by the committee, called the Global Strategy. And as you can see, it's a very different way of looking at heritage. And it's quite anthropological, and it's very much stripped down to a kind of very simple concepts. And the hope was that people who, from countries where there were no monuments and, very formal places, could find their way in under these very general themes. And it was really meant to encourage nominations from different parts of the world. who had felt that they couldn't meet the threshold of outstanding universal value as it had been defined in those early years, particularly with Mr. Presswehr, who was very much in the art historical kind of frame. So this is not fiction. I mean, there are reasons why these things were happening. So you can read the themes. It's not so much the themes as the fact that the global strategy also led to changes in the criteria to make them more easy to make them more inviting for different parts of the world. And then the advisory bodies started doing thematic research in areas that were underrepresented. So there was quite a lot of activity. However, if you look at the year 2000 and you look at now, there's not much difference. After a huge amount of effort at the level of the committee and the advisory bodies, I find this fascinating to actually put the two up, because there really isn't much difference. And so the question, so in that context, when I hear that one European country has put in 10 new sites in eight years, I mean, it's not alone, there are many others, you can see how there's a tension there, and I don't have an answer to that one. But there are research questions around that about what would be equitable, which what does it mean to be equitable? That's also a different issue. Okay, my third question, should the interpretation of outstanding universal value be reconsidered? And I think your presentation touched very much on that. It's a complicated question, because buried in this question is what I consider one of the biggest threats to the convention, and that is the politicization of the convention. The idea of looking beyond your own borders and acting on behalf of the greater good has kind of been swallowed up in what I consider a pretty strong national push, based to a large extent on pride and also on economic interest related to tourism. So if you're a country and you've put in a site, and the advisory bodies have done a good technical evaluation, and they say this doesn't meet the criteria, that's their job. They're told by the committee, it's in the operational guidelines to be strict in their analysis. So they do a comparative analysis, and they say this is one of many, it doesn't meet the threshold of outstanding universal value. But you're the country that wants that property. So what are you going to do? You're going to attack the technical advice. And that is what has been going on. And I would say in St. Petersburg it was very, very vicious. They started from day one coming out the gate, and they continued the whole time. And in fact, there's going to be some meeting between states parties and the advisory bodies to talk about better communication and on and on. But in fact, what it is, it's really this thing of not liking the advice they're hearing. That's really what it's about. You can also question whether the advisory bodies are always right. They're not. The second part is that the advisory bodies have to put the gate down on the 28th of February, I think. And so sometimes there are things that have happened between that time when they make the recommendation and the meeting which actually justify inscribing a site. So that it's not always to rubber stamp, but I'm going to show you something that really makes the case. 100% is when the committee and the advisory bodies would always agree, that the technical advice would always agree. And you can see what's happening. Now we're down to under 30% of the time that the technical advice is being respected. So when I said that one leg of the stool is being kicked out, this is what's happening. So you're all young professionals. This is a really important issue for you, because we're going to move on in this world, but if this convention is going to survive, we have to bring back the scientific side. And that there are various ways to do that, but that's a really important issue. And I just would say as a sidebar, I take pride, there have been very few technical chairs, although the convention says you should have a specialist in cultural or natural heritage as the chairperson. That has not been happening. There are now diplomats. And in fact, next year it's going to be chaired by a deputy prime minister in Cambodia. So we're really upping the ante in political terms. But I take pride in the fact that I was a technical chair in 2008, and look at the little blip here. And I'm saying, yes, this was my thing. That's my best thing about that slide. But that slide is very discouraging to my eye. Okay. Question 4. This is a question of unintended consequences. If we draw attention to certain sites or list certain sites, do they then become targets? You heard this morning about Mali, you know this story, and there's the Bamyan Buddhas. The committee actually UNESCO sent an envoy to speak with the Taliban to try and save those Buddhas, and I believe that the Taliban waited till he came and then they did it.
No, it was not Taliban from the valley. We brought Taliban from outside the valley.
In Bamyan. Yes, but it was really UNESCO's intervention turned it the other way. It might not have happened at all if that, and the same with the Mali. I mean, the committee said there was no correlation between the listing in danger of the Mali sites and the destruction, but the people that were doing the destruction said there was. So, I mean, you have to say that there probably was. And they could see it live streamed, right? More unintended consequences. The other one is the question of doing a listing that does meet outstanding universal value, has some territorial issues, and in this case the site was on the border between Thailand and Cambodia, and it was actually under my chairmanship that there was a negotiated settlement between the two parties during the meeting, and I did table a chairperson's decision and hammered it down, and then war broke out and some people have been killed. So, I mean, this is World Heritage was being used in that case to try and make territorial. It has nothing to do with heritage. So, but it's a question about this relationship to something that's bigger. Another question: are there limits to cultural landscapes? And here I'm saying this with some dread in front of the expert in cultural landscapes. But this cultural landscape discussion began in the 1980s over rural landscapes. And then it was an ongoing discussion. It was really a European-centered discussion because the kind of big national parks that exist in Australia and North America and Russia do not exist in much of Europe. But there are very beautiful natural parks, but they have a lot of impact with people. And in fact, this is when the convention was created, you had monuments over here and you had big flora and fauna over here, but this middle ground had not really been worked over. So this was a very important concept and a good concept. It was worked through, and a new category was created, and probably one of the elements that was the most troubling for some people, undoubtedly not for you in this program because you do so much work with intangible cultural heritage, but you, in the context of the time, was associative cultural value, where there was almost nothing to be seen on the land except the landscape. Now, those of us who live with indigenous peoples, we know that this is kind of normal to associate sacred mountains and all that, and the attachment to place. But this was also an issue that was quite difficult for some countries to understand. It raises the question of what does designation do in terms of ongoing processes in the cultural landscapes, and I think that's a big research area, because the idea that you do the day that it's designated, you do a management plan for the cultural landscape, unless you do it in a way that it allows for ongoing dynamic processes, you're in fact going to freeze it. So I think it's a challenge from that point of view. And then we've started getting cultural landscapes that are so huge that it really raises questions about management. This one came in 2010 in Brasilia from Mexico. It's 1,400 kilometers long. It goes from Mexico City up to Texas, I believe. Has 55 different properties, I think, associated with it, but it's the whole trail. And it really raises questions about definition of boundaries, the management capacity, what is being commemorated. And this year we got one that's even more challenging. So, for me, this is a very interesting research area. But this landscape in Rio was designated, and you have to think of it's like the hole in the donut. The hole is the buffer zone. The city is the buffer zone. And what was designated was all the parkland around, which you can see, and all of the arms going out into the sea, and the front beach with the Copacabana, it's so well designed and so on. Everyone's got the song in their mind. But it does raise the question of, what are the controls in the buffer zone? Are there any? Is there anything there? How big is it? Meshtil, stop doing that.
Oh, yes, and you're dancing.
Okay, so anyway, on that, just to say the question of cultural landscapes is, to me, one that is opening, and it raises values questions, management questions, and this dynamic processes question. I think there are several things sitting in there. In fact, the Quebec government just redid its heritage law, and one of the things, it's on a landscape level, and one of the things they're going to insist on is a landscape level, cultural landscape conservation plan. And I think that's impossible. That's a recipe for freezing. So I think this thing it's to be continued. Question 6. What's the balance between tangible and intangible values? We are talking about World Heritage Sites. And here I'm really only going to focus on one element of that, and that's the whole discussion on authenticity. That brings you back to the European focus of the convention at the beginning, and stone cultures, and other parts of the world that don't have such permanence have the habit of replacing wooden parts, but it's still the old temple or it's the old house or whatever. And Japan got very concerned about this when they signed the convention. They were afraid that their sites would be turned down for lack of authenticity, because authenticity at that time was very materials based. So they sponsored a big international meeting, and the co-rapporteurs were Herb Stovall and Raymond Lemaire. Now, you've met Mr. Lemaire. He was way back when they created the Venice Charter and Equitable. So he's absolutely in what I think in German you say Monument Kultur. And then you had Herb Stovall, who's coming from Canada and is very open to urban landscapes, and he's very, indigenous peoples, and it was really a meeting of old world and new world. And it was happening in Japan, and it was an amazing meeting, and the papers in there are very interesting. What began the attributes of authenticity, which are very materials-oriented at the beginning, design, materials, workmanship, setting. There was an add-on for cultural landscapes, which is, I think, quite vague, and I don't think it's very easy to determine whether or not it meets the criterion. And then it took a long time from the NARA meeting to actually get it into the operational guidelines. But if you look at now the definition of authenticity, you will see it's shifted way over to the associative value side. If you just look at some of the words like a spirit and feeling and use and function, none of those words were there at the beginning. So the whole idea of what is authentic to meet this threshold has really changed in order to accommodate countries because the convention was getting larger and larger. And I give you two examples as kind of reminders that right at the beginning, when Warsaw came forward, ICOMOS's first reaction was, this is a reconstruction, this has no authenticity. Eventually, with a lot of political pressure, it was put on the list, but the committee then said no more reconstructions, and there were none for a long, long time. In fact, they turned down Carcassonne was turned down on the basis of reconstruction at the first round. So the committee held to that rule for a long time. Now, I just show you one other example, just to give you where we are now in terms of authenticity. On the left, you have a postcard of what the bridge at Mostar used to look like. It's a 1925 postcard. And in the 1990s, during the war, the bridge was destroyed. And then in the early 2000s, it was reconstructed. And the country was absolutely determined and came back 2 or 3 times on this site in order to get it inscribed as a symbol, as you see. And again, the attack on the advisory body was very strong. And eventually, this is not in anybody's writing, this is in my notes, but eventually the person, it was Susan Denyer from ICAMAS, got pushed into a corner and she said something like, there's a distinction between reconstruction of fabric and the restoration of intangible dimensions. And she then went on to say, the property is deemed to have a special kind of overall authenticity. I mean, this doesn't stand up. I'm not taking sides on the site, I'm just saying this is not solid. You can't take that to the bank the way that's written. And so to me there is this issue of at what point how far out can you stretch the elastic in terms of intangible value, and how much do you still have to be rooted in a site in this convention? That's the question for me. And the 7th question is about Endanger Listing and whether it's effective. I said to you earlier that countries resist going on the list in danger, and you know how much the list has grown. This shows you 11 years of Endanger Listing. Has it changed? This shows you how much countries fight not to be put on the Endanger list. And if I tell you that in the convention the idea behind the Endanger Listing was these would be the sites that would get priority for funding because they were in the worst condition. And the idea was each one that was on the Endanger list was supposed to have an operational plan for its recovery, and they were supposed to go out to international donors. Totally different concept. And now countries really, really, really do not want to go on the Endanger list. They see it as a black mark against their country. So I think that this is a lost cause. My personal proposal is to change the name to the list of priority funding sites, and then maybe it would work. But because that was the idea behind it. But these words have really, really not been effective, and that's, in my view, a mistake when they wrote the convention. That they didn't foresee where that would end. And just to say, the other thing is that because countries resist, the sort of poorer countries end up on the Endanger list. There's no operational plan, there's nobody looking for funding, and they sit on that Endanger list for decades. And that's really sad, because that was not what it was meant to be. We did have a success, by the way, this time with the Philippines. They have finally perked up and they've turned that one around, which is great. But it's really, this tool that was created didn't work. Okay, second last question. Can conservation and development coexist? This, I would say, after the theme of let's beat up on the advisory bodies, which came many times in St. Petersburg, I would say this was the theme number 2, was the coexistence of development. They didn't actually even say sustainable, for the most part, development and conservation. So this is a very serious issue, and it's one that you touched on quite deeply in terms of, and in fact, Thomas Raab also talked about that. It's really important for human society. For the first time in my memory, this site came forward at this meeting, and basically the request, and it was finally negotiated, part of this park will be excised in order to put in a uranium mine. So this and this after we had successfully, Mechtilde was a leader in getting the International Council of Minerals and Mining, Metals and Mining has a policy. If you go on their website, they have a policy of no-go mining in World Heritage Sites. So this was a big achievement in 2003, But here we are, we're back at it again. So this may be okay, maybe it's not okay. Again, a research question. How much can you take out of a property like that, which has big flora and fauna? Can you take out part of it and it's still okay? At what point is it not okay? To me, these are sustainable development questions. Part of the development is also the development and conservation debate is around tall buildings. This one, the World Heritage Committee hammered away at Russia for 5 years and actually won. This project will not go ahead on this site, but that was right where my hotel was in St. Petersburg, and I just could not imagine. It was supposed to have 10,000 employees in there, and it's like a 4-lane bridge. I just could not imagine that happening, and it was right on the edge of the historic center. But it is also, Gazprom wants to have a new headquarters, and so how do we, by what measures, this is the research question for me, what is an acceptable level of development? And I don't think anybody has the answers to that at this point, or the methodology. Another example of same, we know that London is full of high-rise. There's actually a letter on the file from the UK at the time of inscription of the Tower of London that they would protect the whole viewscape of the tower. I mean, and they couldn't do it, of course, because it's private sector. But we on the expert side don't have the means to make the arguments. We have a gut feel, but we don't have any methodology to and. The sidebar at this committee in St. Petersburg, it's an old issue, was a lot of discussion about visual integrity. Who says that something has or doesn't have visual integrity, and on what grounds? You know, there are some people who measure it through cones and various ways, but where does that lie? And then, of course, sometimes the development, you're going to have a lecture from Brigitte, I think, on Wednesday on this, the delisting of the Elbe Valley World Heritage Site in Dresden, and because of this development, the bridge. And again, was that the right decision of the committee or not? The committee got itself painted into a corner pretty early on and took a very strong stand, and then internal politics in Germany really made it impossible to stop, and then the committee really, it went over 4 or 5 meetings, and by the end the committee could not have done anything but delist by the end. But was that an appropriate response or not? And I mean, it'll be interesting when you hear Brigitte. I've never actually talked to her in detail about it, how she feels about it. And then one that is heading towards delisting is Liverpool. I would say as soon as this project goes ahead, that this Liverpool will be delisted, and this is not a very positive outcome. Okay, so you can delist a site, but what have you accomplished? If you go back to the fine ideals way back, I mean, you haven't really accomplished much. And so it's kind of, if a city like Liverpool has to make a choice, they're going to make a choice for development. And they said they didn't understand that when they were designated World Heritage that they couldn't develop. And I mean, this is all the murkiness of this whole area. Okay, last question about sustainable tourism and whether there is such a thing as sustainable tourism, or if anybody actually knows what it is, because one thing for sure, there are more people on the planet and more people moving around, and this is just something off the WTO website about the growth in international arrivals. The other part is that it's very clear World Heritage is a big label, and many, many tour companies are using it. So obviously, when you get on the World Heritage list, tourism goes up. Can it be managed, or is it a poison pill? In fact, I read a piece in the paper yesterday from some country talking about the World Heritage curse about tourism. So it's pretty serious. You also had Angkor Wat. I mean, Angkor Wat, I look at it from a couple of perspectives. One is like the conservationist in me, and sort of the place is being torn apart physically. the physical side, damage is very strong, but I also look at it from the visitor experience point of view, that this is your moment to be in this place, which is a place of great meaning, and this is what you're going to experience. How would you like that visitor experience? I think that's one of the world's great slides, actually. It just goes on forever, and there's no meaning in that, and that's a reconstructed part of the wall. So what have you accomplished by going to that place? So, and more. The one on the right, by the way, is Quebec City, which now has opened itself up to these huge cruise ships, and that's what it looks like in Lower Town, Quebec, which was very small when the cruise ship arrives. It's just, and all of the people have moved out. Nobody left. But one place, just as a good example of tourism, is the Alhambra, where they have really done an excellent job of using technology to control visits. And you have a barcode on your ticket in certain popular places. You have to be there in your half hour, and if you don't make it in your half hour, you don't get in there. And if you want to know how frustrated some people are because the signage is not great and they don't really understand what's happening, go and look on TripAdvisor and see how many complaints there are of people who didn't get in to see certain parts. But it shows you that actually technology can be used to do some control. But this is a whole research area that's wide open as far as I'm concerned. We were talking yesterday about that Rebank study in 2009. It's a very lightweight study. It doesn't tell you much of anything. And just two other thoughts on tourism, and one is this question of respect. And for the Aboriginal people in Australia, well, Jennifer would know better than I, but they feel that when you walk on that stone, that you're walking on their ancestors. And it says, do not go up here and just take a look. You go on Google Images and see how many images look like that. And the other one is because of the imperative of tourism development. I just show you, this is a very good example, that all the vernacular architecture here was wiped out in order to make a big platform for buses. And the understanding of the Chinese was that the only part that was important was the palace, and this speaks a bit to your point about how, the various values that are out of sight. That it's not just the World Heritage values, there are other values there, and they just wiped it all out. So, moving forward, you'll notice this word rejuvenating the convention, which is from the Director General. Mechthild read that to you earlier. She made an appeal, the Director General, and I would make it also, to reinstate scientific principles and impartiality, and that's a role for research, for sure. If we don't have clear answers on the research side, it's very easy for the diplomatic side to just dismiss the technical arguments. So there needs to be very solid research. I think that the kind of empty battles over whether we're going to list site X on the list in danger or not, which can go on for hours, in the country defending and so on. I think that one of the ways forward is to focus on shared conservation issues like climate change and so on, where you have countries working together on a more broad basis and not with a national interest on their one site. I think this, in general, it could be a way forward, because there's a lot to do on risk management and a lot to do on climate change and a lot to do on the techniques of conservation, which are kind of being lost in the process. And the question of introduction of solar power. And, there's a lot of things happening in the world that we have to take into account, and that's an area. I don't know how you do it, but there needs to be a better dialogue between the officials that are in the institutional framework of countries, and I suppose the universities, if you want to call it that way. There isn't much crossover, and I think you referenced that too about the lack of bridge, and it probably needs to happen within countries first, in a way that the institutions actually use the universities and the universities interact with. The question that I've been raising all along, it's a good, solid research on heritage theory and practice so that we have a good basis for decision making. And then another one which is less in the research area, but it's very clear that there needs to be a major mobilization of resources to help a lot of these places, which is something, there aren't many people actually engaged in that, I would say. And before closing, I'd just like to pay tribute to a good friend of mine and of Mesh Tildes and a number of people in this room, Herb Stovall. Herb, he's a Canadian. He died of cancer on the 14th of March this year at the age of 63, I think, or 64. And Herb, in the local paper, they entitled, there was an obituary to him that was entitled Suitcase Stovall, because he had done 85 missions for World Heritage Sites around the world. And there was an obituary to him in the Kathmandu Times, because he had worked very hard in that community to help with conservation and so on. He was a really great person. He was instrumental in rethinking authenticity, and he also, when he was working at ICROM, he did a major piece on risk management. So he was a wonderful teacher, and he engaged people and communities. You could send him to any community and he could find a way of having a dialogue. And it's sad for us that we lost his voice, so I just wanted to pay tribute to him. And that would be it. That's World Heritage in an hour. One question?